past Grand Master, Grand Lodge, Russ Charvonia from California. I was just there for the 172nd annual communication, which was a very fun time and a very impressive job done by the Grand Lodge. Most worshipful sir, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Cameron. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with why, kind of how I met you at the annual communication. I met you at the kind of exhibit hall where there was information about the Masonic Civility Project. So let's start with that, because that was the first time I had ever heard of it. But I thought it was a terrific idea, initiative, terrific project. So tell me about what the Masonic Civility Project is.
Happy to, because this is one of my greatest passions in life, next to my children, wife, and grandchildren, frankly. This started back in February of 2014, when I suggested at the Conference of Grand Masters of North America that the world about us was becoming increasingly uncivil, and that if left unchecked, this may turn into the kind of world that we're not willing to leave to our children and our grandchildren. I then further suggested that as Masons, we have the language, the tools, the symbols, the tenets, the principles of treating one another with civility, with dignity, with respect. And I went on then to suggest to them that it is up to us as Masons to take those tools and symbols and concepts and principles and so on, and first work to improve our own individual behavior and be more civil in all of our dealings with folks, and then to spread those lessons out to our greater communities. And out of that session back in February of 2014 in Baltimore, Maryland, arose the Masonic Family Civility Project, which is alive and really, really vital across the globe today.
So even to start with the most basic of, at the most basic point, how would you define civility?
I frankly won't. And here's the reason. I've had people tell me that civility is just about being polite, courteous, applying the rules of etiquette. I've had other people tell me it's nothing to do with that. It's about gaining a relationship where you can engage in difficult conversations. And my own take on it is that it's somewhere in between. You don't need civility when the relationship is going swimmingly. You need it when you encounter those rough spells. I don't think you can be civil to somebody with whom you don't have a basic level of respect and dignity for that person. And yet it is far more than just avoiding the difficult conversations or being nice. So it's really difficult to put a definition on it. And where you started this is exactly where we started back in March of 2014, when after that conference, we formed a task force, and the first thing we thought we ought to do is define the word. We spent the first 4 months of our meetings doing that, wrestling with it. We came up with some pretty cool stuff, but nothing that was quite fitting the bill. Upon which time, after 4 months of futility and frustration, I did what I should have done from the outset, which is what? I Googled it. I typed in the word civility into Wikipedia, and it said, wait for it, see incivility. It was one of those aha moments. No wonder we're having such difficulty defining it. It hadn't even been defined in Wikipedia at that time, the font of all knowledge, okay? There is now a definition, and it is the definition that we first put on there. I don't know if you or your listeners have ever tried to enter anything onto Wikipedia, but it's a bear. They just keep rejecting. And thanks in large measure to worshipful Brandon Lippincott from a lodge here in Southern California, he was relentless. And we now have that definition. And your listeners will be able to go to it and they'll see reference to the Masonic Family Civility Project through and through. So short answer is, it is treating people with dignity and respect, so that we can engage in difficult yet vital, important conversation. If you force me into defining it, that's how I will define it.
The difficult conversation component of it, I guess the question then naturally flows. It seems because I've been hearing around, I was born in 1983. So, I'm relatively young, I guess, though I don't always feel it when I wake up in the mornings. But I remember as early as, 1990s or 1991, I was 7 or 8, on the news, you'd hear people saying we need to have a conversation about X. I remember we need to have a conversation about racism. We need to have a conversation about, it seems like the statement, we need to have a conversation about difficult topic, insert difficult topic, has been, for most of my life, been a pretty common theme. But either that is happening and it's just not resulting in a more civil society as people thought it would, or we've misunderstood the idea of conversation. And despite what, it's almost like with social media and it's almost like we pantomime conversation. We think we're having it, but we're not having a true conversation in maybe a classical sense. So I guess my question to you is, how would you define a conversation? Do you think you're seeing it now on social media or news and stuff like that? Or do you think, I guess, how would you define a productive conversation and a civil conversation?
Do you have another 2 or 3 hours that we can really break all of that down? Because you touched on several different components. A civil conversation is one where you are heard and you truly hear the other side. That you're not engaged in fake listening. That you're not just about trying to get your point across. That neither party or none of the parties are just trying to convert the other person or people over to their way of thinking. That, in my mind, is what is missing today. And I'm going to change the phrase to civil dialogue. There's a whole lot of conversations going on. There's a whole lot of information out there, more than any time in human history, of course. What isn't happening is that productive dialogue where we have a difficult subject. We need to bring in and create space, safe space, productive space for different opinions, for different perspectives, for different ways of looking at it. A lot of the training that I do through the Masonic Family Civility Project is the civil dialogue exercise. And this was formed by some folks out of Arizona State University, the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication. It's incredibly productive. I'll share with you just a little bit of it, if I may, briefly here. What you do is you pose a difficult, divisive statement. I'll give you an example since this is a Masonic realm. Most of us are familiar with Rainbow for Girls, Job's Daughters, and DMLA for Boys, the youth orders. So one of the statements I'll use both with adults and young people is, it would be appropriate for Freemasonry to sponsor a youth order that's open to people of all genders. And when you hear that, I imagine that most people come down on either side of that. Oh, absolutely, it should be co-ed. We shouldn't be separating out by gender. There's so much to learn from people, and we need to be all welcoming and all inclusive. And others are of the attitude, no, boys are boys, girls are girls, there's nothing in between. They need to be in their safe environments and so on. So the way this civil dialogue exercise works is the facilitator puts out that statement. They then talk about some of the background behind our youth orders, the purposes, the benefits, and so on. The facilitator then asks for a person to come and take one of 5 seats that are arranged in the shape of a horseshoe. Somebody that strongly agrees is on one side, somewhat strongly disagrees is on the other. Next to them is somewhat agree, somewhat disagree, And in the center of the horseshoe, the fifth hole, is the neutral, undecided person. The facilitator then shares certain ground rules for how we're going to maintain civility while we're doing this. And again, I'll go into more detail as we have the time, but effectively it means engaging in active listening, not formulating your opinion before somebody's finished talking and so on. Once these ground rules are understood and accepted by the panelists, then a conversation ensues. And it's interesting when we set the stage that yes, we're all going to treat each other in this manner. We're going to respect differences of opinions. We're going to talk in terms of I statements instead of you statements. I think, I feel, I believe, instead of you. It ends up being a very productive conversation. And at the end of it, and I'm really fast forwarding through this process because there's a lot to it, but at the end of it, the facilitator then, I as a facilitator ask two questions. What did the participants think of this experience? And it's always overwhelmingly productive and they really enjoy it and appreciate it. But here's the most powerful part. I ask each of the facilitators, if you can now take any seat, where would you be? And more often than not, several of the panelists would change positions. What does that demonstrate? We're in this world, especially when you look at our politicians, where if you change your mind on a viewpoint, you're labeled a flip-flopper. You're a waffler. It's a sign of weakness. And Freemasonry especially teaches us to keep that open mind, to be willing to see things from other perspectives. And I'll tell you, one of the points where I'm most proud of who I can become is when I come into a discussion pretty dogmatic that my point of view is the correct one. But once I listen to different points of view, different discussion aspects, I change my position, either 180 degrees or just somewhat. I'm proud of myself when I'm open-minded enough to do that. By the way, it doesn't happen all the time. That's the benefit of this discussion, this civil dialogue exercise, is being able to be open to different ways of seeing things, even if it doesn't change who you are, doesn't change your mind.
Does the perception of, or how do you think that that dynamic is altered by the perception? And it could be real, it could be imagined. That's kind of a whole other can of tuna. But the perception of harm or harmful behaviors. So, well, the most topical example would probably be would be vaccines, for example. So, if I myself, this is just me speaking personally, I view somebody making the decision to not get vaccinated as a harmful thing to, not necessarily to myself per se, because I think I'm young, I'm healthy, I exercise, all that jazz, but harmful to society as a whole. It's a negative impact on the ability to, fight through this pandemic. I recognize a lot of people, have different views on the vaccines, but I do, just for myself, when I try to engage in civil discourse or civil dialogue around the issue of vaccine mandates, for example, I can find that a challenge. And I think the reason I find that a challenge is because I view the act of not getting vaccinated as harmful to society. Whereas if somebody were to, what's a better scary movie franchise, Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, I have strong feelings about that too, in a sense, Nightmare on Elm Street, but I don't view, the opposite side as having harmful interests. So I can engage civilly in that. But I've noticed, I think this idea of what constitutes harmful behavior to an individual, to a society, I think that's where a lot of the sticking point is. We all kind of recognize that you can't, walk up and punch somebody in the face. It's obviously a harmful act. But then what about certain words? What about the choice not to get vaccinated? What about, we seem to be in this gray area where we can't quite figure out what constitutes harm to society. And I think that's where a lot of the challenge of civil dialogue lies. Just what are your thoughts on that and how the harm metric can impact this?
So first of all, I commend you for your keen observations, Cameron, and how you're able to take what you think is a simple concept and open it up to where we could spend hours and hours on it, because we literally could on each of the things that you've raised so far. But two aspects I'll follow up on here. One is not directly on point, and that is one of the reasons the civil dialogue exercise is productive is because it creates a safe environment to have difficult conversations. I know that's a little different tack than you took, but I think we can relate it back to where you were coming from. In order to have those kinds of conversations with somebody that's the polar opposite belief as you, we can't just have it behind keyboards or just spontaneously. We need to come to some grips, some terms of engagement, if you will, for how we're going to engage in a productive civil conversation about it. So just, getting in the discussion with somebody in the line at the grocery store about it isn't likely to be a successful conversation. That makes sense the way I've said that? Let me come back to your greater harm issue, because Masonry to me talks about this. There's all kinds of symbolism in our Masonic lodge rooms, of course. There's one that I look for in every lodge room I enter. It's not required furniture in California lodges. I have a feeling it is where you are, and that is the point within the circle. That is the most lesson-filled symbol of just about anything else that you'll find in a lodge room or in our instruction. And of course, that point that's in the center is us, the individual who's always striving to become a better person, better husband, better father, better son, better citizen, better employee, all the way around. And we have all these pressures hitting on us from every different direction of society that makes it really difficult to be that kind of person. So the first thing as a Mason we're taught to do is what? Take the compasses and circumscribe a circle around ourselves. And that creates a boundary beyond which we're not to allow our passions and our prejudices to begin to intrude upon the rights and enjoyment of somebody else. By drawing that circle around ourselves and our behavior, does that mean we shouldn't be passionate? Not for a minute, because without passion, nothing worthwhile would be accomplished. But what it says to me is I need to have enough awareness about how my words, my behavior, my actions are impacting somebody else, to where when I recognize that I'm saying something, doing something that's beginning to bother you, to intrude on your safety zone, I owe it to you as a fellow human being to back off. It was a famous Supreme Court justice, forgive me for not remembering who it was, who said that your right to throw your fist stops at the edge of my nose. Okay? You can throw fists all you want. It cannot approach my nose. I'm paraphrasing. Same type of thing with us. And I think you brought up the subject of social media. Social media is a two-edged sword. When the installing officer hands the gavel of authority to the master upon his installation, he admonishes him, use it judiciously. In your hands, this may be wielded as an instrument of great good or of greater harm. I liken it to a butcher knife. Butcher knife can be used to prepare your meals, keep you alive, sustain you, or it can be used to murder somebody. Social media is the same way, a two-edged sword. We've connected with people that we otherwise wouldn't have but for social media. Long lost friends, new friends, family. And yet look at the bullying that goes on behind the anonymity of that keyboard. Bring this back. We need to create safe zones. And this isn't just political correctness, as some people would want to label it. This is about basic respect for our fellow human beings. And that's where you were going with it. Your take on a desire not to get vaccinated not only affects you and those in your household, but the greater society. So we need to engage in treating people with that dignity and respect, This whole civility effort boils down to one thing: our own individual behavior. I can't control what you're going to do, Cameron. I may have a little bit of influence over it, but that's all. The only person's behavior I have any influence or control over is my own. Masonry teaches us to work every day to break off those rough and superfluous edges to ourselves, and always, always, always strive to become that more perfect ashlar, recognizing we will never get there. Till the day we take our last breath, we will never become that perfect ashlar. It means every day we need to work to improve ourselves. We start by taking the compasses, circumscribing that circle around our passions and our prejudices, and making sure we're not intruding upon the rights, enjoyment, and safety of our fellow human being.
And I think that's kind of where the challenge lies, I think, especially, now moving forward. I think it's why you're hearing perhaps so much discussion in the States about succession and kind of a cold civil war and all that type of jazz. Is I think that the real struggle that exists today is defining adequately that that circle with the compasses, and what is a personal choice versus what is a choice that has repercussions for society. I mean, there's always been that tension a little bit. So if it's, say, 3 o'clock in the morning and the street is completely deserted and I decide to drive on the left-hand side of the road just for fun, right? You could argue it's personal choice, no one's out, no one's going to get injured, but a police officer would disagree and say, well, no, even if no one gets hurt and there's nobody around, there's a set of rules in place, and it behooves you to follow those rules. And then you can use driving while intoxicated as an example, right? Even if you are intoxicated and you drive and you make it home safely and nobody's injured, it's still a choice that has a set of repercussions, and the police officers will respond. But I think for various reasons, the main struggle that exists is what is how do you, and this is a Masonic question too, how do you set those compasses? What is the appropriate circle? Is the appropriate circle the most literal interpretation of the hand and the fist and the nose? I can't physically attack anybody, but beyond that, I'm free to make whatever choices I want, so long as no one is injured by them, versus a more expansive circle, which recognizes that perhaps there are other types of actions that can have harm. And I think that's where a lot of the challenge with civil discourse is coming from, because if person X is saying, this is my personal choice and I have the right to make it, but person Y feels as though that personal choice has repercussions either on them personally or society, it can be a real challenge to find a civil discourse. So I guess just how would you, as a Mason, as a man, as a father, how do you look at your personal set of compasses, and how wide do we draw that line, or how wide do we make that circle?
As you're getting from me, no simple answer. Mine is just going to be a couple of sentences. First of all, when I'm faced with a dilemma of any type, I have different ways, different tools that I implement to try to help me to make what I think is the best decision. I then try to force myself afterwards to evaluate the decision I made. And at times where I'm pleased with the decision I came to, I ask myself, was this because of my parental upbringing, my religious training, or Freemasonry that enabled me to make that best decision? And the conclusion I almost invariably reach is I can't separate the three. It took all of those sets of influences to help me to be the kind of person to make that decision. And so, you know, the circle around myself is one of those influences, as well as what would my religious training tell me? How would my mother and father have guided me on this when I was younger? And that in combination and unison helps me make the kind of decision of which I'm later proud. Keep in mind that circle is only around your behavior, your words, your attitudes. I can't control that other person who's not willing to be vaccinated for whatever reason, or who insists on driving while drunk. All I can do is on my end of things. Now part of what you're getting at, in my opinion, is, okay, how am I going to engage that person who has what appears to be a 180-degree different attitude or opinion about it? Fair statement. Is that where you're trying to go?
Yeah, I think that's part of, yeah, that's the main crux, especially when there may be, for example, rules that need to be enforced. And depending on who is responsible for enforcing those rules. So, you know, the driving intoxicated example, you know, how you could use police officer has to enforce the rule. John Smith says, what's the big deal? I didn't, you know, I didn't hit anybody. I got home safely. You know, why are you bugging me? Or, you know, in the case of Ontario, Freemasonry will use the vaccine requirement. Ontario lodges are required, if they are meeting in person, to provide, every member has to show proof of vaccine before they're allowed to attend the meeting, if lodges choose to resume meeting. And, you know, a lot of Masonic individuals are uncomfortable with that requirement, either because A, they're not themselves vaccinated and don't want to get vaccinated, or they may be vaccinated, they may just not feel it's appropriate for Grand Lodge to dictate these type of things. I would say Grand Lodge is following provincial requirements, which I think is fair to point out. But, you know, how does the lodge or the person tasked with checking vaccine requirements, you know, engage civilly with somebody who is saying, I should be allowed to attend a meeting regardless of vaccine status? You know, how do you, it's not so much how do you engage in discourse, but when there's a rule that must be enforced or a protocol put in place, how do you engage civilly with somebody who's opposed to, you know, the enforcement of that rule?
So this is what makes leadership so stinking difficult, is how to get buy-in from people who are all very different from one another. Some people are what I'll label rule followers. They're going to do it because, you know, it was so stated to them. Others are complete contrarians. Whatever a leader says, they're going to do the opposite. My belief is that most people, my informal surveys show that 80% of people, roughly speaking, are very reasonable. And you have 10% on either pole, however you want to define it, that are going to be those staunch people that just aren't going to buckle one way or the other. They're going to hang on to their dogma no matter what. So the first answer to your question, Cameron, is appeal to the 80%. Recognize that you're going to have 10% on either pole. They're going to be your difficult folks. And then it's all about how to cope with difficult people. There are certain types of decisions and conversations that need to be made in different ways. There are edicts. Your Grand Master will issue an edict when he thinks it is necessary. There are deliberations, your annual communication where you consider different legislation. That's more of a deliberation where we propose a piece of legislation or resolution, and we listen to people talk in favor and against it. And together the craft make the best decision as forming a consensus as a deliberation. So there are edicts when it's a pure sense of somebody sensing it to be a matter of of extreme importance, life or death or safety or what have you. So that's where the law comes in, and it is, we like to think it's black or white. As an attorney, I know it's not always so black and white. There are deliberations where we're looking for more of that group consensus, the democratic way of deciding what the best course of action is. And I think we have, first of all, separate what kind of matter is this. Your grandmaster has decided this is based on the provincial law, that this is a matter that warrants an edict, a pronouncement. He's not going to have a debate about it. Now, he may have had a debate with his executive committee or his cabinet about it, but he's not going to open it up democratically to the entire craft as you would at annual communication. One other thing I want to emphasize, if I may, there are people with whom I simply will not have engaged in a conversation about certain issues. There was a certain grandmaster from the southern US who had attitudes towards a certain race, our Black brethren, that I found so abhorrent that I was not willing to subject myself to any more of that kind of conversation. I am not going to sway him. His view was so sickening to me that I just extricated myself from the conversation. I'm not going to do that to myself. I'm not going to belittle him. There's just no sense in me doing that. And I got out of it. So part of what I would recommend to you and our listeners is we do this without thinking about it, but now a little more consciously. When we're in that difficult situation, ask ourselves, how important is it to me to preserve this relationship? I have a dear, dear brother who is on the polar opposite end of the political spectrum with me. He and I were driving together to a Masonic event about 2 hours away, and it didn't take long for the conversation to hit that raw point between the two of us. And we probably talked for about 60 seconds before we both looked at each other and said, you know what, time out. Let's talk something else. Because the relationship was so important to us, we know we're not going to convince the other of it. We don't want to ruin the relationship and risk losing it. So we ended up having a very enjoyable drive the rest of the way down and back because we agreed not to have that conversation. If you think about it, that's the same way in Masonic lodges. We won't talk politics or religion. Here in California, we don't talk about traffic conditions or baseball either, because that's a big dividing line between North and South. But over a cold drink, we will have those conversations. But we're not going to risk the peace and harmony of a lodge by having those conversations inside the lodge.
So the idea of within the lodge and without the lodge, one thing I really appreciate about your work, everything that you sent me, the press package and your website, and this is an idea I've had for a very long time, but I think you've expressed it better than I could through the Masonic Civility Project. And I truly believe this. It might be a bit arrogant on the part of me as a Mason, but I think it's true. As a strong and a vibrant and a healthy craft will result in a stronger and a more vibrant and a better world. And I think that does have to do with those principles that are taught within the lodge, then taking them without the lodge to the broader community. So, one challenge though that we face, and I'm trying to fix it or improve it through this podcast, you're trying to, improve it through all your work, including the Civility Project, is, it's wonderful to have the ideas of Masonic civility and express those to the community. But I don't know of any jurisdictions right now in North America that are experiencing an increase in membership, an increase in the fraternity. So how do we as Freemasons grow the craft, bring these ideas of civility to the outside world, while we struggle with membership issues, attendance issues, revenue issues, loss of temple issues, all those things, it seems like a lot of Masons are turning more insular. They're so focused on preserving the lodge, they're not necessarily thinking about how to bring Freemasonry to the wider world. So I guess how do you, in the Civility Project and just as a Grand Lodge officer, how do you balance these, and how do you address this issue of perhaps the craft in decline while also the civility side of it and bringing that to the larger world?
I've got 3 points. I'm saying they're 3 so I can try to remember them all. First, I just lost the first one. First, we do this not in the name of Masonry. We do this effort because we are Masons, because it's the right thing to do. So when we're out in the community espousing ways that we can all govern our behavior better and become more civil and help our local communities, we don't have to talk about it in Masonry. We can talk about speaking on the square or treating people on the level, meeting people on the level, and people don't need to know that came from Masonic roots. The idea of taking the compasses and drawing a circle around yourself and so on, I share that with non-Masons all the time. So we do this because we're Masons. We don't have to do it in the name of Masonry. That's point number 1. Point number 2, we have developed a group of civility ambassadors. We started with Masonic civility ambassadors, of whom we have 5 or 6 dozen across the globe. And the idea here is that we can provide them with resources and anecdotes, stories of things that work and don't work. So that when they find in whatever their community is, be it their house of worship, be it their workplace, be it their town or their city or what have you, when they're seeing an issue bubble up to where it could end up tearing the community apart, a la Charlottesville, a la Ferguson, Missouri, a la, name all these different places across not only the U.S., but the globe. They can get in there and help the community have these difficult conversations before it ends up becoming a full-on conflict. So we are now developing not only Masonic civility ambassadors, but community civility ambassadors. And we think that's one way we're going to be able to get the word out. Now, specifically, in terms of Masonry and the growth versus the shrinkage of it, I have found that young people are coming to the craft, members of your generation and the next generation behind you, they're coming to the craft in droves. Your jurisdiction, our jurisdiction, almost universally, if you look at who's coming in, it's the under 30 crowd for the most part. By the way, think about this. Next time you meet somebody and you tell them you're a Mason, 9 times out of 10, start to keep track of it. They're going to tell you, oh, my grandfather was a Mason. We lost your father's generation. It used to be the grandfather was a Mason. He expected his son to become one, who expected the grandson to become one. We lost that generation. That's why we're so low in numbers right now. The younger men are searching for something that they can be a part of that's bigger than themselves. And they're not finding that gratification in their workplaces. They're not finding it in their houses of worship. They're coming to Freemasonry. They're not learning about it from their fathers. They're only finding after they became a Mason that their grandfather was a Mason oftentimes. They're coming to the craft to improve themselves. They're coming to the craft to be a part of something bigger than themselves. The civility effort is fitting that model for them. It's filling that need. It's something tangible they can latch onto, they can put to use as soon as they receive their first degree. They put it to greater use after they become a fellow craft Mason. And my goodness, by the time they're a master Mason, they learn about the Civility Project, they are living it, breathing it, talking it. That's what's going to build the craft back up. By the way, the older, more mature Mason, who we don't see at Lodge so much anymore, he is also grasping onto this. It's another way that it's reconnecting him with his Masonic values in a tangible way that he can recommit and put those back to use in his world. So this Masonic civility effort is bringing new members in, and it's re-engaging brothers that we otherwise may have been losing, or actually in many cases actually lost, and brought them back.
Do you think, I mean, this is a chicken and the egg question, so it might be hard to know for sure, but when you talk about that missing generation, from the grandfather to the grandson, right, missing the father's generation, do you think that I think it's safe to state, and we should always put premises out front, I think it's safe to state as a premise that both you and I would agree that civility has been on the decline in North America at least, or probably the whole world, that civility has been on the decline since that father's generation kind of missed Freemasonry. Do you think that, was it that civility declined and therefore that generation was less interested in civil groups like Freemasonry? Or do you think that, because Freemasonry missed that group, that resulted in a loss of civility? Like, what do you think? Do you think the decline of Freemasonry resulted in loss of civility, or do you think the loss of civility resulted in the decline in Freemasonry?
Unscientifically, I think it's both. In your community, I imagine if you drive around, you're going to see street names and parks and buildings named after Masons in your community. How many Masons in your lodge now are involved in the community to that end that they would warrant having a name or a park named after them upon their death? I'll submit to you it's far fewer than it was back then. Part of it, as a sheer percentage of the population, we are minuscule now, where we used to be a very noticeable part. Think about this. It used to be, and I think Masonry has changed for the most part, not everywhere, but it used to be, where are you going tonight, Dad? It's a lodge. Dad comes home. How is lodge? Fine. It's like talking to your teenager, right? Masonry today is much more, in most parts, many parts, family-oriented. When I was Grand Master, my wife traveled the state with me, traveled the globe with me. She knew, other than the esoteric parts, of course, everything that was going on with Freemasonry. And I think Masonry is better for that. But you made a premise that the world today is less civil than it was in prior generations. Let me attack that in just a couple ways for a minute. I'm going to separate less civility aspect and division, how divided we are. There's no question to me, we are at a low point in our civility across the globe. By the way, we tend to think it's just North America. I talked to folks in Ethiopia and Serbia in the last couple of weeks, and it's horrible there. So I am willing to pronounce it a global pandemic. I really am. A lot of people have told me states of civility and incivility is purely cyclical. And if we wait it out, it will return to a better state. To which I respond two things. One is, what's wrong with us shortening this negative period if we can? And incivility is like water. It's going to find the path of least resistance. That's easy for it to happen. Regaining civility requires affirmative effort. So number one, let's shorten this negative period if we can. Number two, and here's my greater concern. I think this has the risk, we're seeing it, of becoming more and more so much a part of our habit, so much part of our moral fabric that we don't know any other way. Here's my greatest concern. What do children learn? What we tell them or what they witness? Far more from what they witness. Our children watch adults bullying each other, which we'd never tolerate with our children, but we tolerate it amongst adults. And our children believe that's the proper way to act. This, I'm afraid, Cameron, is going to take a generation or more to turn around. So yes, we are more uncivil than we have been. I'm not going to say ever. I mean, the period of the U.S. Civil War, Revolutionary War, those are pretty uncivil periods. At least now we're not, for the most part, dueling to settle things. Are we more divided? It sure feels like we are. However, I've read several different studies that really changed my point of view on this, that indicate that about most things we are not more divided than we have been. What's happening, though, is we are forming echo chambers around ourselves. And social media, here's the problem with social media. The algorithms help that to happen. Social media is able, as I understand it, to track what kind of news you follow and how long you dwell on that article. And so it's going to feed you more of that kind of perspective, where it becomes our truth. It becomes subconsciously who we become. We are even going to the point of where we are up and moving to relocate to a point where we think the people think more like we do. Same number of people on either side of any issue that you point out for the most part, but we're forming these blocks that are harder to break through. We're not intermixing so much. We're even doing this, with different types of demographics, religions, race, political beliefs, so on and so forth. And that's where society is really lacking. And that's where the Masonic Lodge can teach the world how to do this. Sorry, I get a little passionate. We bring people together of every opinion, sect, belief, and opinion. I said opinion twice there. We have the systems in place to help us to get to know that brother before we have the opportunity for our prejudgments, our prejudice to take over. I'm going to give you an example of this. I was a relatively young Mason. I was a person I had recommended to become a Mason was gay. And during the break in between the degree, I'm sitting next to my good friend Bill, who is a generation above me. And Bill was very blue collar. He didn't graduate high school, but I love this man. We're sitting next to each other, and he says, that new candidate, I think he's a little, I said, you mean gay? He says, yeah, I guess that's it. He said, isn't it great that doesn't matter? I saw him think, the wheels turning. Yeah, I guess you're right. Okay. Bill he grew up in Oklahoma. He had those built-in prejudices. Freemasonry allowed him to think for a moment about, should that prejudice, the door to that be kicked open a little bit? Because of the safety of Freemasonry, that we're able to do that. And now our task is to go show the rest of society how to do that. By the way, not the rest of society, that 80% slice of society that can be open to it.
So for that 80% slice of society that is open to it or can be open to it, tell us about more the specifics of your work. So where can we find the information about the Civility Project, what you have coming out for the Civility Project, and if a Masonic Lodge wants to interact with the Civility Project, get some information about it, perhaps bring you along for a meeting. Many lodges in Ontario, again, although as of November, Masonic lodges in Ontario will be able to meet again in person with the health caveats in place and health protocols. Many lodges, to my knowledge, are choosing to continue meeting virtually for the time being. So that does leave, an opportunity to bring people in virtually from the Civility Project to talk to the lodge. How can we interact with them, and how can Freemasons get more information about this project?
This is where I'd like to encourage your listeners to grab a pencil and paper, or for the millennials and younger, open up your phone. First of all, MasonicCivility.org. MasonicCivility.org is our clearinghouse, if you will. We have all kinds of information there. We have trust board articles for lodge masters that are facing writer's block and they want to have an article. We have those for you. If you want to do a presentation in your lodge or in your Rotary Group or Chamber of Commerce or what have you. We have presentations. They're not protected. You download them. You make them yours. You can do that. MasonicCivility.org. I will never turn down an opportunity to present to any of your lodges that ask me to, or districts, divisions, whatever they are. And I have a team of really well-qualified people that do a better presentation than I do. If somebody wants to talk about that further, info@MasonicCivility.org. Info@MasonicCivility.org. That comes to me. We'll get somebody to speak to you. A couple of other resources I'd like to share, if I may. If they go to civilitycenter.org, under resources, you'll find a civility toolkit. And we helped to create that, 6-7 years ago. If you're facing incivility in your workplace, in your community, in your family, dare I say, in your lodge, there are drawers of tools that you can pull out that will help you. And that civil dialogue exercise that we discussed earlier is one such tool. There are thousands of others in there. Finally, you heard me at the outset of this, Cameron, talk about how this is my passion. I believe we have a short window of opportunity here to try to turn things around. I believe it is up to us as members of the Masonic family to do it. Frankly, if not us, then who? I'm not willing to stand by and just say, this is the world my grandchildren are going to inherit. I feel an incumbent duty upon me to do what I can to restore it. To this end, I've written a book. It's called The Civility Mosaic, how anyone can use the principles of Freemasonry to restore civility to society. It is due out early November. It will be published through McCoy Publishing, MACOY Publishing, and it can be pre-ordered now. I know this sounds like a cheap, shameless plug, because I guess it is, but I wrote this for 3 distinct audiences. First of all, the Mason. The Mason's going to find those Easter eggs in there that I think he's going to really enjoy it and grow from it. What I deem to be the Masonic curious, the people that have heard about Masonry, is it a cult or is it something I really want to know more about? I think that person will enjoy it. But I've also written it for the person that just wants to know what they can do to restore civility. And at the end of each chapter is an exercise that'll get the reader thinking about the role that they can play. And it kind of takes them on a Masonic journey. So this was a labor of love. At sometimes points it was a labor of hatred, but I'm anxious to see it on a bookshelf. And I hope that your listeners will also be motivated to check it out. And I hope they appreciate it in the manner that it was written, that it gives them step-by-step things that they can do to better control their passions and their prejudices.
Do you think that, or to what extent have you seen you talked earlier about kind of the return to lodges from the grandfather to the grandson, and kind of a new, I suppose, millennial, I guess, or Gen Z generation joining lodges, or I guess Gen Y. I don't know. We're getting that the grandsons back involved. To what extent, or how much do you see your passions mirrored or reflected in the incoming generation? Do you believe a lot of them are joining out of a desire for civility in their life, and also perhaps a desire to, if they find civility in Freemasonry, which they should if the lodge is being done correctly, to then bring that to the outside world and use tools such as the Civility Project? Even demographically, who are you finding? Younger Masons interested in your work, older Masons, a mix?
I'm seeing quite a mix, and the team that we've assembled is, in fairness, it leans mostly older, in part because they have the time. younger generation is so busy running their careers, their families, their households, that so that's part of it. But I will tell you, I have complete and total confidence in this next generation. And to the point where I think us, pardon my language here, but us old farts ought to just hand the keys of the world down to over to your generation and younger and say, start cleaning up our messes. My daughter is 26, my son is 39. These young people get it. Our job as the older generation is to mentor them, to help them to avoid the mistakes that we've made, and then give them the tools and the resources to let them sail. We talk a lot about the younger generation having a short attention span. That's not my experience. You look at what younger people will do when they're into something, and they are super honed in on it. What younger people, in my opinion, don't have the patience for is wasting their time. And so as a lodge, we need to be delivering what it is they're coming to Masonry seeking. And if we don't, that's where they're going to have a short attention span. They're going to say, this isn't what I thought it was. I'm not getting what is rewarding to me. I'm not going to take time away from myself or my family for something that's not worth my while. So one of the ways we need to do that, this civility effort very much engages them. There's no question about it. They're eating it up. But we need to communicate with our young members and not kowtow to them, but ask them what it is they're seeking. Some of them want that personal growth more than anything. Some of them want the social aspect and that safe kind of socialization with people who have common values. Others want the esoteric. Let's figure out what it is they're seeking, and especially if you're in an area with several different lodges, match them to the right lodge, because a lodge can't be everything to everybody. And I think we'll be more successful at keeping these young brothers and engaging them. In California, prior to the pandemic, we were just starting to start growing again. Pandemic threw that back probably for 2 years, but the U is turning up in terms of membership. It's our job now to keep those men engaged. And again, this effort can help to do that.
I agree completely. I think this effort, your effort, the Masonic Civility Project, will both help keep new Masons engaged and perhaps even bring some of the Masons that are, we used to use the term rusty, and then people said it was derogatory, so I don't know, but rusty Masons, for lack of a better term, perhaps bring some of them back who maybe will find a reason to return to lodge, and perhaps get some people who are considering joining more likely to join.
Two more thoughts, if I may.
Yeah.
First of all, when I was doing these presentations in person, I always encouraged prospective members to come, as well as our youth orders and women and others. And I give just enough masonry, but I don't skirt the line as to what I'm not allowed to share. And every time they've done that, we've received petitions on the spot. I've had so many men say, this is what I was looking for. So that's the proof in the pudding to me, if you will. The other comment is, there's been so many times over this last 7 years that it just feels like our efforts are in vain. I'm pouring out so much time and effort and money into this. I'm just going to hang it up and go do something that's more rewarding. And about the time I get that way, I'll receive an email or a phone call from somebody that says, Russ, something you shared with me X number of years ago helped me in this situation. And that's what stokes the fire. That's what Masonry is all about. Just like teaching, the noblest of all professions, in my opinion. The teacher never knows when they change that student for the rest of their life, but they know they did. And the best reward is when that student comes back and thanks that teacher. We are making a difference if we are living the Masonic principles in all of our aspects of our life. We're going to blow it here and there because we're human. But we're going to atone for it. We're going to make it right with the person whom we've harmed because we're Masons. And we're going to build relationships because that's what Masons do. So that's why I'm going to keep working this effort. As gloomy as it appears to be, I have faith in the next generation. I have faith in the craft. I have faith in humankind that we can repair our world.
Yeah, I always liked, Elon Musk had a quote, it's better to be optimistic and wrong than pessimistic and right. Which I think is a pretty I can tend to lean more toward pessimism, but I think he was probably right. Even if the pessimists are right, and let's say there's a nuclear war of some sort, we're living in a dystopian future, no one wants to be around the guy who's saying, I told you so, right? Like you still might as well be optimistic because you're probably, whether you're correct or not, you're probably going to achieve more. It's probably more of a, you're more likely to find success, I suppose, with that attitude. I think whether it's about civility or Freemasonry, right? It's easy sometimes to be very pessimistic about things when you look at numbers, not just membership, because membership is its own thing. I think sometimes we focus too much on that, but numbers in terms of attendance, right? Numbers in terms of it's very easy to become pessimistic about things, but I'm not sure. And as somebody who can lean more towards pessimism, I'm not sure it's a helpful attitude to actually have. I think optimism is probably a far more useful and pragmatic approach.
As I said, that instability is easier. It's the path of water. Pessimism is also easier. It's harder to be optimistic. And what I try to do is balance optimism with realism. We need to be realistic so that we don't miss things that are right in front of us that need to be addressed. To just go out there with the rose-colored glasses and say the world is in great shape right now is not realistic. I am optimistic that our efforts and our teachings will help us to turn things around and create the kind of world we want to leave to our children and grandchildren.
And I think that's a good that's a good kind of path to go down as we come to the end of this interview. When you think about the future and the type of world you'd like to leave, well, both the type of world you'd like to leave for your children and grandchildren, but also the type of Masonic order you would like to leave to our entered apprentices and our prospective candidates. I mean, what do you see? What is that type of world to you? Both Masonically, what would you consider a successful Masonic order, and what would you consider a successful world?
First of all, I love this interview. I love your questions. And next time we're together, we're not going to just spend an hour together, but we're going to find some solid time because I want to learn more about you. Freemasonry, my vision of Freemasonry is where it is relevant. It is where society knows that they can depend upon us. It is where it has such a profound impact on individuals' lives that it has the ripple effect to make a better world.
I sorry to interrupt. I love that answer because that has been what I've been trying to do with this podcast. With I think the biggest mistake Freemasonry made, probably right around that lost generation time period, is we became obsessed with chasing membership when we should have been chasing relevance. It's not, if John Smith doesn't want to be a member, that doesn't mean Freemasonry cannot be of benefit to him and his family. And there's many ways for Freemasonry to be relevant in the lives of people who are not members or who don't have family, who aren't family connections, right? It can be relevant because of the temple. I've talked a lot about the relevance of the Windsor Masonic Temple to the community. It's a place of weddings. It's a place of graduations. It's a place of kenos and bingos. And even if somebody's not a Mason, if you grew up in Windsor, Ontario, you more than likely have fond memories of the Windsor Masonic Temple as a place of relevance in your life. But so often, and you look at this for any skilled endeavor, which is what Freemasonry is first and foremost. It's a skilled pursuit. Mixed martial arts, if you want to use that as an example, it's not only relevant to other mixed martial artists. It's relevant to everybody who watches it on YouTube, who looks, who researches it, who watches the YouTube things. And so I just love that answer, because if Freemasonry focused more on being relevant in the community and less on just how many members we have, I think we would get more members because there'd be more relevance, but we would grow in the sense of having community support, which is far more important than just another number on the roll.
Back to something you said earlier, which is it's your sense, and I agree with it, that Masonry has become very insular. And it has that elitism to it. I would rather talk about minding the West Gate, and I use that instead of guarding the West Gate. Guarding makes it sound elitist. Minding is making sure we're bringing in the right people for the right purpose with the right motivations, and then delivering to them the proper Masonic experience so they stay engaged. And that's how it's going to be a great relationship. Masonry is, in my mind, every bit as relevant today as it was 300 years ago, and maybe even more so.
And economically even. So Grand Lodge of California, the 172nd annual communication, I'm sure that the hotels and restaurants and bars within a 10-block radius of the Grand Lodge building were quite happy that weekend. I don't know, and this is not to cast shade on the Grand Lodge because they did a terrific job, but how many of those restaurants, bars, hotels knew that the increase in business they saw over that weekend was a result of Freemasonry, right?
Oh, they know.
And if they know that, well, then that's another example of community relevance. Maybe then they offer discounts to Masons who are coming in, or they create bonds or relationships with the Grand Lodge. Maybe other cities, not that I absolutely loved, well, I didn't love the hills, but I love San Francisco. The Grand Lodge building was incredible. Like, it's so beautiful. But maybe, and this is something I've talked about with Ontario, because we always have our Grand Lodge in Toronto, maybe one year Los Angeles or another city says, we want to host an annual communication. Maybe the mayor says, we would like, 200 Masons, however many it was, we would like all those Masons to stay in our hotels and eat in our restaurants. And maybe San Diego, maybe different cities start trying to, because then they recognize and view Freemasonry as relevant to, if nothing else, relevant to their economy, which matters,
In my community, a town of 110,000 people in Southern California, the city of Ventura, December 2017, we had wildfires that destroyed 800 homes. I couldn't get to my office, I couldn't get to the lodge, and so on. Within a matter of days, I want to say it was 3 days, our lodge hosted a pop-up shop. We had goods donated to us from all over the world. We have a 4-story building. In the hallways and elsewhere, things were stacked floor to ceiling with new merchandise, baby diapers, formula, clothing, so on and so forth. And not only our Masonic family, but members of the community, they were working overnight to get things sorted and so on and out on the shelves so we could open up 9 o'clock the next morning and give people, no charge for this, give people clothing and toiletries and food and so on. I'm so proud of my lodge, and I'm going to share the name, Channel Islands 214, for doing that. That is Masonry. When there's a need, we stand up. We meet the call. And it doesn't have to be something as evidence as pronounced as that. Bringing it back to civility. When we as Masons note that there's something brewing in our community that's really starting to rip us apart, let's engage. Let's just open our doors to facilitate that civil conversation, that civil dialogue, to try to lower the temperature. We're not being political about it. We're not taking sides. We are doing what Masons did 300 years ago and 260 years ago in this country. You know, think about the formation of the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. It has so many Masonic, those documents have so many Masonic values through and through because so many of the drafters were Masons. And guess what? They didn't fall in lockstep and just agree this is the way it should be. They yelled at each other. They wrestled with each other. Because they were so passionate about it, they wanted to give the best chance at having a good democracy that'll last. All right, I know you need to wrap this up, so I'm gonna bring it back to the next easy question that you asked. You know, what kind of world do I want for my 6 and 9-year-old grandchildren? I personalize it. This is why I'm doing this. And I want a world that is inclusive. I want a world that is understanding. I want a world of opportunity. I want a world that doesn't shy away from difficult problems, but meets them head on in an effective, productive manner. I want a world of dignity and respect for all. I think the two definitions of what I'm looking for out of Masonry and out of the world fit hand in glove. It's one and the same.
I have to, I know when we're talking about wrapping this up, but I have to add to something you said, because I like that. And it's something I've been talking about for Freemasonry in general. You use the phrase, like, open our doors. Did you, or to what extent did you mean that, like literally, like, do you think that a Masonic temple can be a site for the community to engage in civil discourse? If there is some type of challenge brewing, do you mean open the doors more metaphorically, or do you think literally you can use a Masonic temple as a space, as a like a third party space, it doesn't have a dog in the fight type of thing, a neutral ground? That's what I'm looking for, a neutral space in which perhaps members of the community that are at loggerheads can come in and engage in some type of civil discourse.
Yes, we've done it. There are two places that I suggest to engage in these civil dialogues. One is a library and the other is the Masonic Lodge. And again, not because we're Masons, not in the name of Masonry, but because we're Masons. Because we are very good as members of the Masonic family, and it's not just Freemasonry that does it, but all of our concordant independent bodies and our youth orders. We are very good about, when we enter our lodge or our chapter or our assembly or Bethel room or whatever it is, of separating the profane world from the sacred world. When we cross that threshold, we do things to put ourselves in the proper mindset to practice the art about which we are engaged. That's why we do the invocations the way we do. Everything we do is to get ourselves in the right mindset. And for our lodge leaders that aren't already doing this, I would encourage you to ask all the attendees to leave their cell phones in the Tyler's room. In my mind, other than it's our calendar now, that's the problem there. But we need to physically, emotionally, mentally separate ourselves so that we can be fully engaged, 100% engaged with the matter at hand. When a member of the public walks into our lodge building, we can help to create that kind of environment where they're shutting out all that other stuff and they're focusing on the matter at hand. So absolutely, please open up our Masonic temples, our Masonic buildings.
And that goes hand in hand with that question of relevance to the community, right? I suspect there was a time, because Freemasonry was so ubiquitous in the 1950s, for example, when it may have naturally occurred to the community if there's a problem or an issue to use a Masonic temple as a neutral ground to try to resolve it. They may not think of it in that way anymore, and Masonic temples may not think of it that way anymore either. They may think the doors are locked except when there's a Masonic meeting occurring or a lodge occurring. So opening it up and saying, look, this is a neutral ground. We have no dog in this fight beyond we want a civil order because we're part of this community. We don't want people fighting with each other. So why not use our building and our temple to try to hash some of these things out? And with the tools in the Civility Project, you can even bring yourself in through Zoom or somebody else through Zoom. You're not using it as a recruitment tool. You're using Freemasonry as a guide to try to hash out some of these issues before things become violent or dangerous or difficult in that way. Seems like a very reasonable and a good idea to me, well worth exploring.
Something we did here in California probably a couple decades ago was we stopped using the word Masonic temple because to the layperson that implied religion to them, and we now refer to it as a Masonic hall. And pros and cons to it. I mean, you and I could have that debate a lot, but there's so much misinformation about Freemasonry that leads people to have these misnomers about it. That was a very subtle, nuanced thing that we changed to try to, make it more open, more accessible to the public.
That's interesting.
Difficulties.
Because I'm applying for several grants related to our Masonic temple. They're government grants, so for obvious reasons, it has to be just secular buildings. Well, not all of them, but the ones I'm applying for have to be for secular buildings. And one of the first questions I got back is any part of your building secular in use, or is it all religious? And I had to respond, I understand that the word temple may imply religion, but Freemasonry is not a religion. Our building is secular in use, and not all faiths are welcome, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up because I've experienced that issue myself just with applying for grants and funding and things like that, and people assuming it's religious in nature. Was that successful? Did you find that change resulted in more people looking at Masonic halls in this case as?
I think so. We don't have pre and post measurements at all to say unequivocally. But I do think, and part of why I brought this up is just to extend this because I'm enjoying it so much, but our words matter. Nuance matters. Something that I said earlier that our listeners probably didn't even grasp because I said it so quickly was when you're in a conversation with somebody, focus on making I statements. I think, I feel, I believe. Instead of, well, Cameron, you think. It changes the whole conversation when I talk from, my point of view and so on. And I don't know what you're thinking. I have no place to be able to say that. I'll give you one more quick example. Have you been in that conversation with somebody, you're sharing something with them, you're excited about it, and they are excited about it, and they say yes, comma, but, and all of a sudden you put up a shell, you protect yourself. Oh my goodness, here it comes, they're going to hammer me, right? Whether that's what they're going to do or not, subconsciously, that's how we react. And if you take that but out and put the word and in, yes, Cameron, and did you think about this? Now we're both building on it. And it just took away that defensiveness. My point of this is Masonic ritual is very precise. Abide by and conform to. There's reasons for it. The language matters. How we say it matters. And I hope every day I try this, and I hope our listeners, if they take nothing else out of this, will try to be just more cognizant of what they're saying, how they're acting in those difficult conversations. And take that split moment before they just react and something comes out of their mouth and say, wait a minute, is this the way I want to approach this? And it doesn't have to take more than a nanosecond or two. and you'll find your relationships are changing. Use I statements instead of you statements. Change the yes but to yes and. Take that moment, reflect before you say something, or especially type something. And you will see your relationships changing. It's not going to be instantaneous because we all have these habits that we formed. It's going to take people a while to hear that Cameron's saying something differently than he used to. The best example of this is inevitably you come across somebody, whether you know them or not, what's the first question out of your mouth to them? What are you going to say? No, before that. How are you? Right? How are you? And I submit to you, we don't care. If you want proof of this, next time somebody says, how are you? Tell them you're lousy. You know what they're going to say? Oh, good, so am I. You don't even hear it. It's a throwaway. So I try not to, and I do this all the time still, but I try to not to ask, how are you? I'll try to ask something different. If I'm in a business, I'll ask, how is business? How are you feeling? You know, I'll try to ask a very specific questions instead of the throwaway, how are you? My point is that we're reactionary. We're so used to, we see somebody, how are you? I'm fine, good, so am I, blah, blah, blah. That's meaningless. And that, by the way, is why Freemasonry needs to be practiced in person. I was a member of the Internet Lodge a few years ago. I wanted to see, long before Zoom and pandemic, if Freemasonry could be practiced virtually. It's a very far behind, a very laggard second best to being in person. Because when I see you in Lodge, Cameron, and I say, how are you? Because it slips out, and you say you're fine, and I can see it in your face, you're not. I can put my arm around you. Come over here. Cameron, I can tell you're not okay. What's doing? Open up to me. And then I can figure out how I can be supportive to you. That's what Freemasonry is. That's how we can be there for one another. Can't do that over Zoom.
Very, very true. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time all the way from California. Like I said, I had a great time there very recently. Hopefully one day I can return and this time head down to the south and perhaps visit with your lodge. But pleasure having you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Cameron. Thoroughly enjoyed.